Welcome everyone to our Monash University Q Project international event, Embedding Quality Use of Research within Education Systems. My name's Jo Gleeson and I'm your facilitator for this evening. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the lands on which I speak and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I would like to specifically acknowledge that the Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung people, communities of the Kulin Nation, are the ongoing custodians of the lands on which Monash University now stands. We pay our respects through our research, through our teaching and our learning to the Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung elders and their past, present and future communities. We also accept the invitation in the Uluru Statement from the Heart to walk together with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. Up front, I'm going to say it, tonight is going to be a blockbuster. We're very fortunate to have a fantastic panel of speakers who are going to inform us. They're going to provoke us, and I'm sure they're going to inspire us to think about how we can use research better in our practices. I'll introduce them shortly. First up, though, I want to give a shout out to all of our live streamers out there. If you are live streaming, we'd love you to put questions and comments in the YouTube chat function. You'll need to be logged in to do this. Instructions were sent in your reminder emails, but we've included them again in the start of our chat function. We also encourage you to tweet if that's your thing. Use hashtags Cure, Using Evidence Better, and Research in Action, and tag at Monash Q Project and at Monash Education when you do so. We'd love as well for as many of you as possible to get involved tonight through our Slido polls. Follow the QR code or link on your device to participate. This is shown here on the screen. In fact, let's go to our first polling question and get you involved. Where are you joining us from? We'd love to hear. I'm joining you from Canterbury in Victoria, which is located on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people. And it's very wet land. I got to tell you, it's not stopped raining here in the last 24 hours. Let's see where people are typing in from. We've got people from Melbourne, fantastic. Adelaide, welcome South Australians. Professor Martin Westwell on our panel tonight is from South Australia. Docklands, okay. Can we go further than South Australia? New South Wales, I love it. Newcastle, we've got great friends at the University of Newcastle in the Quality Teaching Rounds teaching team. Echuca, fabulous. Singapore, welcome Singaporeans. We've got some people from Cambodia as well. This is more like it. One of our panelists, Professor Annette Boaz, is joining us from London. Have we got anyone from London? I know it's early there. It'd be good. We'll keep a track of where you're all coming from. For those of you who are not familiar with the Monash Q Project, we're a 5-year project in partnership with the Paul Ramsay Foundation, and we're investigating how Australian schools can improve their use of research in practice. Over the last 4 years of our project, we've been very, very lucky to work closely with school leaders and teachers, as well as many system actors, such as jurisdictions, policymakers, research organisations and brokers. Through our work, we've discovered a lot about quality use of research, and in particular, what enables school leaders and teachers to use research well in practice? It'll be no surprise that education systems play a significant role in influencing and enabling educators' improved use of research. But what do we mean when we say the word systems? And in what way can these systems enable improved use of research in education? What lessons about system-led quality research use can we learn from other contexts? These questions and others will be covered by our rockstar panel tonight. Let me introduce you to them. We'll hear first from Associate Professor Mark Rickinson, who alongside Professor Lucas Walsh is the Chief Investigator and Director of the Q Project. Next, we'll then hear from Skye Ramsey, Principal at Barrack Heights Public School in New South Wales, and she'll provide the very important practitioner perspective. Professor Martin Westwell will then respond from a jurisdiction perspective. Martin is the Chief Executive of the Department for Education in South Australia. And last, but certainly not least, is Professor Annette Boas, who is an international expert in research and evidence use across different sectors and different contexts. Annette herself is based at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So one and all, settle in, get involved, respond to polls, ask questions, create discussion. And I'm sure that we'll have a lively session because of it. To start this off, Mark, it's over to you.
Thanks so much, Jo. And great to be with you. And great to see people from so many different places across Australia and also internationally. There's no doubt that our challenge tonight, our topic tonight of embedding quality use of research within education systems is an international challenge. So it's great to have so many people. Now, if there are any rock stars on this panel, they're definitely not called Mark, but they are called Skye, Martin, and Annette. So the real insights will come from the other three members of the panel who are definitely rock stars. My role is to introduce our topic really just by clarifying some of the key terms in the title of the webinar, and then sharing a few findings that have emerged from our work within the Q Project team. So if we go to the next slide, thanks Chantal, we'll just start off with clarifying terms. Now we've got three in the title: quality use of research, systems, and embedding. So let's start with quality use of research, the next slide, which goes right to the heart of the Q Project's work. Now, quality use of research is about using research well. It's about not being satisfied with asking whether we use research. It's about engaging with the question of how well we use research. And our definition of quality use of research is thoughtful engagement with and implementation of appropriate research evidence. So two ideas there: the thoughtfulness of our engagement with and the appropriateness of the research evidence. So that's right in the diagram, right in the red center, in the core, those two core aspirations, those core components of using research well. Surrounding that in blue are the individual enabling components. So we need educators who have skill sets, mindsets, and relationships that are conducive to using research well. But we also need to pay attention to the organizational enablers in red. So we need supportive leadership, we need supportive culture, and we also need a supportive infrastructure. And surrounding that in green are the system level influences, which are really our concern tonight. And that's about what role can system level influences play in enabling appropriate, thoughtful engagement with and implementation of appropriate research evidence, that quality use. So that's quality use. If we go to the next slide, we need to think about what do we mean by systems. And I want to encourage us to be open to two ideas connected to systems. The first one in the bottom right of the slide is about systems as a structure or systems as an entity. So that's like the organization that Martin works for, a state education department or a Catholic diocese, or, you know, we talk about the Australian school system. We talk about the Victorian education system. It's an entity, it's a thing with lots of organizations within it. But also systems are a perspective, a way of seeing, so a way of understanding research use at scale, one that pays attention. It's really trying to see the wood rather than the trees, trying to see the big picture, trying to see the interconnections, trying to see dynamic change over time. So we need to be open to system as perspective as well as system as structure. And if we move to our third key term of embedding, this again is an idea. If we go to our next slide, Chantal, this is again an idea that's got two dimensions. And it's really important that we're kind of open to both. Open to embedding as integration, which the question might be, is using research well integrated within and across our system? But we also need to think of it in terms of support, which is our system supportive of using research well? The two things are connected, but are different. And we need to be open to both. And if we move then to the next slide, the question is, well, why do these things matter? Why do we need a webinar on quality use on systems and embedding? Well, quality use has been very much overlooked. Almost all the focus and the investment and the debate has been about improving the quality of evidence, but far less on the quality of the use of that evidence. Systems too, within the evidence use literature and within the evidence use infrastructure developments initiatives internationally are a recent focus. There's been much more piecemeal, small scale kinds of interventions, not so much system-wide approaches. And so it's also important from that perspective. Embedding is important because it's tended to be too much about push in terms of pushing research evidence out, as opposed to supporting the use of that evidence in terms of the demand side. It's been much more supply driven, research production driven, as opposed to research use demand driven. So that's what those things mean and why they matter. Let's move to the next slide and just consider, what has the Q Project learned over the last 4 years in relation to the system dimensions and quality use? So I just take to the next slide and just share with you the data that we're drawing on. Now, the Q Project is mainly focused on school level use of research evidence. And so we've collected evidence through data through 2 surveys with teachers and school leaders, and over 900 across those 2 surveys. And we've also done in-depth interviews with a much smaller group of 27 educators in different schools across, and all of these are across 4 states and 5 jurisdictions. In terms of system actors, we've also done surveys with system actors, 158, about how they use research. And then additionally, we've worked together with system actors and educators in terms of co-designing interventions to support quality use of research evidence in practice. And QURE stands for quality use of research evidence, or quality use, or using research well for short. So what have we learned from analysing these data that have come from educators and system actors? Well, I'm going to share 4 findings which have come out so far within the Q Project. So if we go to the next slide, the first slide will surprise none of you, and that is that system actors are varied. So when educators, and to a lesser extent system actors themselves, talk about the role of systems in relation to using research well, they make reference to lots of different kinds of players. Yes, they talk about people connected to jurisdictions, state education departments, Catholic dioceses, independent schools associations, but they also refer to education organizations, both federal and state. So professional learning providers, other national education organizations like ACARA, like AITSL, Also there in the bottom left, research organisations like universities and research brokers like Evidence for Learning or the Australian Education Research Organisation are also obviously referred to as system-level actors in relation to using research well. But also really important to recognise on the right-hand side and in the bottom of the screen, that systems can also be networks of advisors. In other words, it can be people as opposed to organisations, and schools can be systems as well. Schools themselves and networks of schools. So system actors are many and varied, but what influence do they have in the eyes of educators on contributing to using research well? Let's have a look at the next slide. The answer is, based on our work with surveys of 900 educators and then interviews with 27, is that the influence of systems on using research well are limited. Now, let's look at this. What this table is showing is we asked an open survey question or interview question about what does using research well mean to you? And it was open text response. We then coded the survey and the survey responses and the interview comments related to that against the components of our quality use of research evidence framework. And what you'll see, if you look on the middle of the interviews, you see very high numbers of references to almost all components, apart from the green, system level influence. Only a third mentioned system level influences. And similar with surveys, it's even more acute, where only 3% of the 492 survey respondents talked about system level influences having some kind of role in relation to using research well. So this suggests that system level influences are underdeveloped within Australian jurisdictions. And this is across 4 states, 5 jurisdictions. The next question though is, okay, so that influence is limited, but what sort of influence do systems have when they do have an influence? So let's look at the next slide for that, which is another, I guess, challenging story in the sense that systems tend to be referred to as barriers almost as much as or more than they are as enablers. So it's almost as if where using research well is happening, it's happening in spite of rather than because of the system. So let's just look at interviews. 70% of interviewees, so 70% of our 27 interviews, talked about systems as a barrier. 33%, 1/3, talked about systems as an enabler. Within surveys, it was very similar, but slightly more, as many who are talking about systems as barriers as they are as enablers. And what are the barriers? What are the issues which come up within comments in relation to systems and research use? Time and access. And I suspect those won't be surprises to people. So this issue of time, of course, within time, it's not just a lack of protected time, it's also the many other demands which are on school leaders and teachers in terms of, like the quote there from a middle leader about documentation and administrative requirements. And the other issue about access, 64% are recognizing that being able to access research evidence is really important, but actually just over 1/3 feel that currently they have sufficient access. So anything outside of departmental publications is harder to access for this teacher. And this was echoed by many, many, many others. So what might we be able to do? What might start to shift systems more to being enablers rather than barriers? Let's have a look at the next slide for what came out. Now, this is drawing on quotes which came out of interviews, surveys, and the co-design process. And there were 3 things that came through very strongly: modeling, involving, and supporting. So modeling is important in the sense it's about walking the talk. It's about practicing what you preach. It's about using research well, need not just be an expectation of teachers and school leaders. It ought to be something that systems can demonstrate and model as well. So you've got the example there of a regional director taking that kind of role, but there are many possibilities here where systems can be not just encouragers and supporters of using research well, but also modelers of it. Also really important, involving. It's really important that evidence-informed practice is something that's done with teachers and school leaders, not to teachers and school leaders. And this came through really strongly from our survey data and our co-design data in terms of the importance of meaningful involvement within using research well for teachers and school leaders and other players within the education system. And of course, supporting. We would recognize that the importance of systems being able to support in terms of time, in terms of resources, in terms of minimizing some of the barriers that get in the way of using research well. So hopefully some of those things might be helpful pointers for our considerations about the ways in which systems can support, model and involve quality research use. So let's go to my final slide then in terms of summing up. There's no question that using research well is a system challenge. It's not enough to just have the core components and the individual and the organization. It can't just happen at the school level. It really does require a system approach. It would seem in the Australian context at present, system level support, system level encouragement and influence are underdeveloped. They are an opportunity for growth. They are an opportunity for improvement. And our work would suggest that embedding needs to involve modeling, involving, and supporting. And that final quote from a teacher there might be just a pointing of the way in that how can we think about in which productive use of research could be baked into our systems. Jo.
Thanks so much, Mark. And I love that quote. I really do. But I also love how you've taken us through different ways of thinking about systems. I know when I first started on the Q project, I just had a narrow way of thinking. I thought systems meant people that sat in departments of education. And it was their actions and decisions that constituted system influences. I stand corrected after 4 years on the Q project, but I think it'd be great to hear from others about how they conceive what we mean by systems. What do they think of when they think of system influences? What comes to mind for them? So I'd be keen for people to pop it in the Slido poll. What comes to mind for you?
Requires a bit more thought than where you're coming from.
I would love to hear from both jurisdiction people and teachers. And I think this is what is going to be great about listening to Skye, followed by Martin, the different perspective of what constitutes a system. So as we can see, there's people that are just like me that think that systems means state departments and departments of education. Hopefully by the end of tonight, Mark, we can get people to think a bit more broadly.
Yeah, and what's important as well is the complexity of players within state departments and departments of education. You've got central office staff, you've got regional staff, you've got frontline, there are so many different players even within jurisdictions. And then of course, international influences, OECD, and yeah, I guess here's some of the kind of the political, the social, the economic, that political power coming through.
Yeah, I love the fact that someone's raised OECD. And I love that somebody here is saying, even those that sit slightly outside of education, but we know impact students in society. And whoever wrote that, I really want to focus in on that, because I know I've got a bit of a preview on Skye's presentation, and I think Skye's going to present a really interesting perspective about what constitutes her system. And who are the system actors within Skye's personal and professional system? Great, we're seeing NGOs, social network NGOs, but a lot of professional associations. Yeah, I agree with that. They're very influential professional associations, and again, Skye's going to be great to listen to in that regard.
Interesting, Joe, that there was one response that's gone down below, but about parents and community members, but also students, but you know, they aren't really, but should be. That's absolutely right. Yeah,
and absolutely. I was only doing an interview actually last week, and I think we forget that students make up the biggest part of the education system. Students aren't, but really should be. I see that now. Well, maybe this is a good segue into hearing from Skye. Skye, who's a principal at the coalface of all of this. It'd be great to hear from you.
Thanks, Joe. And thanks, Mark. That was very insightful and great to get the good oil thinking and starting this conversation. Before I begin and share my story, I'd like to acknowledge the Five Islands and Wadi Wadi people from the Dharawal Nation, and this is the land where I join you from today. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land, as well as the emerging custodians, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to live, learn and educate on these lands and raise my children in this nation. If I can change that first slide, Chantel. So who am I and why am I here? I'm the proud principal of Barrack Heights Public School on the beautiful south coast of New South Wales. And I've had the privilege of being a principal for the past 10 years, with 4 years in my current school. And what a wild ride the last 3 of those years have been. As you can see on the slide, Barrack Heights Public School is a really complex school, but the school and the community is something that feeds my soul. Critical to the context in regards to my story this evening is really about when I arrived at Barrack Heights. I was the third principal in 3 years with an unprecedented amount of staff turnover. I'm also fortunate to hold the position of chair of the New South Wales Primary Principals Association Human Resources Reference Group. And this role really gives me the opportunity to meet with system leaders and with the top echelon of the department school workforce team and provide feedback on the initiatives our system develops and champion the voices of my colleagues and what the decisions happening at the system level, how they will land in our schools. Personally, I'm a mum of a blended family of 5, and a bit of a random fact, Joe touched on this in the personal essence. The random fact is that I'm a Navy wife, and I'm a wife that drills my husband about the strong systems and structures that the Australian Defence Force has in place and how I can emulate these systems in my school. But I really need to set the scene here. And I don't know, Mark touched on not being a rock star, but I'm certainly not an expert in this field. This is my story, and it's a warts and all story. And it's about the journey our school went on to create our own system using our experiences, our own connections and research as the catalyst to drive critical change at Barrack Heights and to support the effective use of research with our educators. And the next slide really pulls that apart a little bit. So as the new principal coming into the school, I needed to sit back and watch. I was very cognizant of the amount of change. So I needed and wanted to see what the true culture of the school was. And to be honest, the data wasn't glowing, but there were so many positive things happening. There was a really strong welfare culture. But from my observations, learning really wasn't where it needed to be, but not because it wasn't important. It really was because there were so many barriers to let the learning culture flow, and the continual change in leaders and staff really didn't enable anything to stick. There was a real sense of this cognitive dissonance. The learning for teachers was transactional. We had compliant, we had passive learners who were extremely interested in what the professional learning we were going through, but there was very limited transference into the practice on the ground. I knew that the PL that had always been presented and was being delivered was evidence-based. So why was this big mismatch? And the more I drilled into the why, I had that light bulb moment. It was because our teachers were not learners themselves. So I drilled further into that data, and only 14% of our teachers, not including our execs, were highly confident they knew where to look for quality research to drive the teaching learning in their classrooms. Only 22% of the teachers and executives were seeking and using this research outside what we had been provided at school more than once a fortnight. 100% said time was the biggest barrier. 67% admitted they didn't really know where to start. And even on those occasions when they did, transferring that into the classroom was in the too hard basket. They didn't have the time to delve into the research or the time to unpack what it meant for their teaching. So at Barrack Heights, we had the why, it was solid. We didn't have the what or the how. So in the next slide, and you see, I really needed to think outside the box. And after a slight panic, because I was really looking at systems and practices to drive a strong student learning culture, but I needed to start with the teachers. I knew that learning had to be more than a transaction, more than that giving and receiving. Laura DeSimone speaks about the need of ongoing professional learning and 20 hours or more for something to really have a deep impact. But everyone was too exhausted for that truly transformational PL to have an impact. So our challenge was, did I have the people to look at this differently? And there was a maze of directions that I could take. We played around with a few ideas and trialled ways of doing things. But it wasn't until COVID hit that we really leveraged the changed landscape to trial a different model, which is small, tailored group professional learning. And it was my own research into transformational professional learning with Deborah Netherlicky that was the catalyst for this change. Now, she's a pracademic who I have a little bit of an academic crush on, because the way she looks at systems and structures and transformational professional learning is second to none, in my opinion. But I needed to draw on my connections and one of my favourite terms, collective genius, because I couldn't just do this from my own research. So I had to tap into other things. Social Ventures Australia was one of the two connections that I leveraged the most. They linked me with a coach who was outside the education landscape, who really helped guide my thinking. I got this facilitation and connection with the Q Project through Social Ventures Australia. And I had the links with incredible leaders who were in various similar context schools with similar complexities that were also doing things differently. This guided the creation of something called a program logic, which was really our plan to get teachers to be effective learners themselves. The New South Wales Primary Principal Association is the other connection that really was a game changer for me. I'm a staunch advocate for the PPA and everything that it provides. And I leveraged absolutely everything and anything I could from our professional association in regards to research, quality professional learning, the incredible networks within the PPA. But I was also really lucky to have unbelievably supportive directors, educational leadership, who have been incredible in the support in this change line process that we've gone through at Barrack Heights. They gave me permission to look at things differently. Bless its cotton socks, COVID changed again. So we needed to think differently. We went into home learning and lockdown. So we created a platform where we could do things different. And so we created a platform where we could house all the research we were using behind what we were doing in our curriculum learning, behind our adult learning, behind our positive behaviour support. The research papers, the podcasts, the websites, the instructional videos, we still had access and had control over the access that our teachers were, what they were looking into. And we included Jamboards and reflection pieces that they can share their reflections on the pieces of evidence. I always participated to show my vulnerability and in how I unpacked the research. And this opened up pathways of collaboration and discussion that we'd never had in our traditional PL sessions. We mainly use Department of Education research papers and research supported by the department for our curriculum side of things, but we also drew from some very reputable sources, both curriculum and for our other initiatives. But the great thing was that I didn't have to do all the research myself, and that's part of the system that we were creating. We had a really strong team of educators at Barrack Heights, and we had the wraparound support by the people that I mentioned before. So the kicker, I guess, once you think you have something sorted and you know where the direction that you're heading, we move back to face-to-face operations. And this professional learning model had been so effective in getting our teachers to become learners, to use evidence to drive teaching and learning. But I couldn't work out how I was going to do this in a face-to-face operations. So the two biggest challenges that we faced were time and budget. Where was I going to get the time inside the school day, because we returned to face-to-face teaching and there wasn't that time in the day? How could I keep this momentum of staff continuing to engage in research the same way they had been behind a screen and at home when they're so exhausted from the teaching day? My entire PL budget for the school, 20 teachers, 18 support staff, was just over $20,000. Let that sit with you for a second. I had to put value into what the research and the evidence was saying and show our teachers that I valued the learning. So what did we do? I hired an above establishment teacher to release each face-to-face teacher for 1 extra hour during the school day for targeted PL. We created small professional learning groups, and each of these professional learning groups worked with the newly appointed assistant principal curriculum instruction, their stage assistant principal and their stage partner to negotiate a curriculum focus area together. Then the APC and I's worked together to find the appropriate research to drive this learning area, and as Mark mentioned, for this thoughtful engagement in research. We used the evidence-based practice of teaching sprints by Simons Breakspear to create a PL model that included using this evidence in practice, but providing the support in action through demonstration lessons, observations, collegial reflection time, and deep analysis. But as mentioned earlier, curriculum wasn't the only thing that we were driving using evidence. So we use evidence and research to drive all our initiatives at Barrack Heights. So in conjunction with the curriculum PL model, we're implementing a positive behaviour system as well, because there's no point knowing the good stuff about quality teaching practice if you don't have the learning environment that supports that practice in the classroom. So we hired another above establishment expert to run this and lead a group of teachers to implement this research-based approach to positive behaviour. Both projects are running concurrently and ongoing, and it will become the Barrack Heights way. We're definitely still tweaking this model that we have, and we probably always will, in all honesty, because there has been so many barriers, but there will continue to be more barriers along the way. But that's probably the exciting space to be sitting in. So moving forward, Chantel, on this slide, the green triangle represents where we were. The blue represents where we are right now. And the orange triangle here articulates how I believe systems can support improved research in schools. So time, I would love time to be included in our staffing entitlement. And this is my hopes and dreams, my personal opinion, to see more value put into teacher learning, to understand how critical teachers are in when their learners, the flow on effect to their students. But the most imperative part of time is that individual schools need to use this time as they see fit. Funding. It's the time for professional learning has to be more of a priority, and this does come in a dollar amount. Interestingly, the academic side of things is something I'm extremely interested in. How do we access more people like Deborah Nedelicki, who have feet in both camps, who are the experts on the ground in the trenches, but also are the ones doing this research? I believe they are the game changers. And finally, Mark has touched on this in the words that he spoke. Accessibility. Synthesized research and evidence needs to be readily available and easy to access. It's not something that teachers and leaders need to have time to sift through to find. There just isn't the time in the day to get that done. Over to you, Jo.
Skye, how fabulous to hear from you. Like, you're at the coalface, and we've got a lot of practitioners, teachers and school leaders online that are creating a whole lot of lively discussion. For me, what I love about what you talked about is, number one, you created your own system around yourself as a professional, but also your school community. And that's really resonating with people like Vanessa online, who have said teachers and school leaders need a lot of support. They need to put support around them. And I feel that your story has done just that. And look, hey, your real life story is, of course, reflected in our research, right? Budget, time, access, professional learning. They're all issues that teachers and school leaders have shared with us over the last 4 years. I'm super interested to hear from Martin now about what his response will be. Not that you need to respond, Martin, I don't want to put you on the line here, but I don't want you to feel under pressure as a jurisdiction, as a policymaker, as a chief executive of the Department of South Australia. But I do think that there's some real issues here that we'd love to hear your perspective on.
Great, thanks, Jo, and thanks, Skye. Look, I think there's lots in that, isn't there, around some of the things that we know around supporting teachers in time, but also the perspectives. I heard I heard Skye talk a lot there as well about the networks that she draws on as well. So I'll try and pick up some of those threads in the next few minutes. I do want to start by saying Nadlu tampinti, Yalaka Nadlu Ghana, Yatanga imparenti. Nadludlu tampinti panaku tuwila Yatanka. Of course, I am acknowledging that I'm joining you from the lands of the Ghana people of the Adelaide Plains today, and pay my respects to the elders past and present there. I think when we've been talking about how can systems support educators in schools to use research better, one of the words in there that I kind of really picked up on was better. What do we mean by better? How are we helping educators? How are we working together as a, when I think of a system, I've got educators in my thinking of a system. I've got students in my thinking as a system. But how can we help? How will we all work together? How is the system working? How are all those connections working to help teachers be more effective, to help teachers have more impact? So if we move to my first slide, this is just a way for me, when I think about our impact, this is a framework, a modified framework that was first, I think, used by the Kellogg Foundation. And I've seen it used by the cooperative research centres in Australia, and also CSIRO use it to scaffold the way that we think about impact. And I want to try and think about this in 3 ways if we can, at system level, at school level, and at a classroom level. And so what really this is saying is, if we to talk about our impact, the way in which we might talk about it, well, first of all, where the asterisk is to say, actually, let's be clear about what our purpose is. And in education, one of the ways in thinking about our purpose is, how do we want the students to be different after the investment of time, of expertise, of money, and of course I'm including the time and expertise of the students in that as well. How do we want the students to be different after that investment compared to before? And so when we think about that, you know, so we might think about, you know, so what do we want? Let's be clear on that purpose. When we've got that purpose in mind, of course, then we're thinking about what are the inputs? What is the investment? How do we shift to then that investment? What's the activity that we're going to do? So as a system, we might be thinking about the activity that we do maybe within the department, within kind of central office perhaps, and then what's our output going to be? And of course, so many times we stop there, and when we evaluate, we say, well, we invested this time, money, expertise, we produced this thing, we put that out to schools, that was our output, that's our job done. But of course, that's not getting anywhere near the impact really. What we really want is to think about, well, how are educators and others taking up that output? Who's taking it up? Is it the right people and the right numbers? Who's using it? What are the ways in which they're using it? So moving to that usage. And only then do I think we can have some understanding of how our activity actually move to impact. Think about that at school level. You can see there's some parallels there. You know, how are we investing as a school? What are we doing as a school? What are we producing? What's our output? And then as a classroom level as well, we might think about that same sort of thing. So what's the input of the educator in that classroom, the input of the students and others? What are we thinking about there? What's the activity that we're doing in this classroom? Who's doing what? Who's doing the thinking? What's the output there? But I'm also thinking about the uptake from the students' point of view. How are they taking it? How are they taking up this learning? How are they taking up the services that we're providing? They might not just, of course, be learning in the classroom. It might be other support services. It might be thinking about their well-being. Who's taking that up and how are they using it? If we just think about knowledge and skills, we're just one small part of what we're responsible for as educators. The development of knowledge and skills in young people, they all might be taking it up. They're all there and they're all in the classroom. But are they taking it personally? Are they engaging with it in some meaningful way? And then some questions about, well, and how are they using it? Are we really setting them up to transfer that knowledge into their lives, or are they just using it for our exams and our assessment? Because, you know, what is the impact that we want? Do we want them to do well at exams only, or do we want them to be able to transfer it into their lives? I don't want that knowledge to be inert knowledge. I want it to be knowledge that's actually changing students' lives, having an impact, making a difference for them. So if we think about this way of thinking about how do we have an impact on our students at a site, classroom site and system level, then if we just go to the next slide, one of the things that we might think about is, well, is what we're doing evidence-based? Are we using best practice? And this idea of best practice, this is an interesting one because we talk about this a lot in education. And what best practice does, I think, is it makes teachers ask a question around what should I be doing? And when we ask that question, when we think about best practice and say, well, what should teachers be doing? What we're implicitly doing is implying that the system is a simple system, that cause and effect are obvious to everyone, that we can just do this thing, do this activity, get this output, and then that will naturally lead to the impact that we're looking for our students. But of course, what we know is that while we can control some of the things on the left-hand side, really, as that starts to connect with students, we've actually got some waning influence. The linkage is much weaker. Things are much more complex. If we think about a complicated system where, you know, maybe we can have some level of expectation of cause and effect, what we do actually leading to an impact on students, teachers might ask a question about, well, what can I do? What could I do? What would be useful to do? And again, I think that's the wrong question. So I don't think we should be thinking about evidence-based, and I don't think we should be thinking about best practice, because education is too complex for that. And if we just move to the next slide, I do think we should be thinking about evidence-informed. Because what that does is it gets teachers to ask the question of themselves, well, what might I do? What could I try out? And now the research plays a different role. It doesn't tell teachers what to do. What it does is it gives confidence to teachers to try this approach or that approach. It gives confidence to teachers to think about, well, who are the kids I've got in front of me, and what is the evidence telling me about what might be useful for these kids in order to get that impact that I'm looking for. And when we look at the research, you know, a way of just doing a quick rule of thumb around some of the research evidence is some of the research evidence is big. The randomized controlled trials, they're big meta-analyses, and what they do is I think they give us context-independent generalizations. So there's a principle in there, there's a really good idea in there, you know. So we know that, you know, the power of feedback, we know the power of self-regulation and metacognition. The development of those things in students tends to be a really important principle. The use of feedback, and of course it's got to be quality feedback, but it just gives us something that to say, well, that's a principle, that's something we might think about. Because then the educators have to think about, but what does that mean for me? What does that mean for my practice? What might I do with that idea of that big generalization that comes from big context-independent research? Of course, other research that we see is research that's smaller scale. This might be the research from practitioners and from other practitioners, from our colleagues, whether it's published or not. But if we think about that published research that comes from smaller scale research, that's very context dependent. So again, there is a role of the educator to say, well, does this match my context? If there's a really good fidelity between that context and my context, well, maybe I'll just do that thing in the way that they did it. I can assume that the activity that I do will produce the same output, and that my students, because it's the same context, will probably take up that learning and use it in a way that will lead to the impact that's described in the research. If, of course, if the context is different, then what we're asking our educators to do is to think about, well, how would I think about this thing differently? What would have to be true for this to have an impact on my students? So when I've got evidence informed and I'm pointing at it in these 4 different directions, those 4 different directions are really important, because what those 4 different directions are doing is saying, well, if you take them on the left-hand side, what are the inputs that are required in order to get the impact that I'm looking for? Of course, the second one then talking about, as we move from left to right, what are the things that I might do, because this is a complex situation, what are the things that I might do to produce the output that I'm looking for? And then the way in which I teach this thing, the way in which I use this evidence, it's also got to make sure that it's it's changing the way that students take up the teaching, take up that learning opportunity and use it. So there's evidence in all different places. What should the inputs be? What should the activity be? How do I get the students to kind of take that up? How do I make sure that my students are using it, this knowledge, this learning, these learning opportunities, these development opportunities in a way that's having an impact? And I think the system can support educators in all of these different ways to use evidence. But it's not something where we just throw the evidence over the, of course, where we throw the evidence over the fence and say, well, here's the evidence, these are things that you need to know. And in fact, of course, there's another way in which educators play a role in this. And if I just go to my next slide. Thanks. It's that feedback loop as well. So if we're saying, you know, so something about, you know, let's take some evidence, some big picture evidence. We know that feedback, quality feedback is really important. And so you think about how you're going to use quality feedback in terms of the activities that you're doing, in terms of, you know, what's going to come out of those activities, the feedback for students, and then how students take that up. And you think you've got it nailed. Well, of course, you've got to test that as well. And so the evaluation loop, of course, is really important. I think the evaluative tools, the evaluative ways of thinking that we can put in the hands of educators can help to close this loop. And then I'll just finish on the last slide. And this is something that really is important for me, and something I talk about all of the time, about how we can be tight and flexible. And what I mean by that is, let's be tight on our purpose of educators. What is it that we're trying to achieve? When we look at the research, let's be clear about what the research is telling us. So what is the research telling us about what we've got to be really tight on? What we've got to have high fidelity, principle or an action? What have we really got to hold on to? but we've also got to be flexible within our systems. I think department systems have to support educators to be flexible. I talk about tight and flexible because you've got to be tight on the principle, but flexible on how that principle is enacted. Tight on what the research is telling us, let's be really clear about that, but then give that flexibility to educators to think about, well, how might that principle be enacted in my classroom to have the biggest impact? Because if we're tight on our principles and tight on how to do it, that won't transfer to different contexts. That won't respond to the moment the teachers find themselves in. We know that that quote around teachers' lesson plans never survive their first contact with students. It's not about just ploughing ahead and doing this thing. We've got to respond in the moment. If we're flexible and tight, then if we're flexible on our principles and what we're really going for, but then tight on just do it this way, of course we've lost our way then. We don't know why we're doing what we're doing and we've completely lost our way. And if we're flexible as systems, that's chaos. We're not holding tight to our principles, and we're not holding tight to the way in which it's delivered. So I do think that systems can get better at being tight and flexible with our educators.
Thanks so much, Martin. I love that, tight and flexible. Skye, that speaks a lot to you, but I'm going to do things a bit differently here. I'm going to throw immediately to the poll and then have a chat to both of you while we're getting poll responses. So to everyone, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What one thing do you believe that system leaders could do to better support schools' research use? Now, Martin, I love the tight and flexible. It absolutely speaks to Skye's call for we need to do it our way. Do you just want to respond to that at all?
Oh yeah, look, so classroom educators are experts in that classroom. Nobody else knows that classroom like the classroom educator. And so, really what goes on every day in classrooms is emergent practice. It's not best practice, it's not everybody doing the same thing. It's the educators responding to what's going on right now. And when they're doing that in the moment, responding to what's going on, they've got their lesson plan, but they're bringing their own expertise to it. They're reading the room and responding to what's going on with the students. But also, I think they're bearing in mind what the evidence is telling them, what the research evidence is telling them, both in their planning, but also in the way that they respond in the moment. So I think absolutely, sometimes we lose sight of that as systems, that the teacher is the expert in that classroom.
Yeah. Well, so I was going to say, right, so how do you, this is a really hard line and maybe I'm asking a challenging question too early in the piece, but how does a jurisdiction provide flexibility, and acknowledge that the school leader or the teacher is the expert, but provides sufficient guidance and all of the things that Skye has outlined that she needs?
I think one of the things is that Skye put it really clearly about, it's not just time, it's how we use the time in schools, and how leaders support that use of time in schools. So I think that the way in which what the system has to do is, when we talk about the kind of fidelity of the research in the classroom, it's a fidelity of the principle, it's a fidelity of the idea, and that has to match with the story of the school, on the context of the school. So I do think that systems might be able to provide those generalizations and some of those research findings, but it's also about supporting schools to say, well, how are we going to use that flexibility? Let's have that conversation about what we are trying to achieve and how this research helps to inform our story in our school to help us to achieve the thing that we want to, without losing sight of the principle itself, the idea from the research that's core to that.
Skye, I can see you nodding. Tell me what you're thinking.
And that all, it goes back to Mark's point too on the thoughtful engagement, and it is that thoughtful engagement in research and what that looks like. So all those things really marry in nicely.
I love it. And you know, we've got such great comments online. For instance, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Thalangika. She's just, I feel like this person is on a Q project talking about the need for thoughtfulness in the way that research is used, but also the way that support is provided to teachers and school leaders from jurisdictions. Listen, thanks, guys. We'll come back to you in Q&A time. But without further ado, I think we've got to throw to Annette and take this up a notch, right? Like, it's not like it hasn't been great, but let's get the macro, let's get the global perspective from Annette.
Thanks, Jo. I'm just going to make some very quick comments because I can see some fantastic things coming from the chat and from that last poll. There's loads of things I'm just thinking about now. Can I have the first slide? I just want to talk, as Jo was mentioning, about the importance of the kind of global picture, about learning from across kind of contexts and places. Could someone move the slides on for me? Thank you. I run an initiative with a colleague, Catherine Oliver, called Transforming Evidence, where what we're trying to do is bring together learning from across different contexts, so different countries, but also different policy areas, so that we can learn together, not do lots of duplication. As everyone has mentioned, you know, we're resource strapped in this kind of area. We need to learn from each other. So what we do is we connect communities, we try and share experience we pick up as we work in this field. And we also try to help to develop collaborative research programs to fill the gaps that exist in this kind of area as well. I'm going to move on again. So just to very briefly show you what that might look like, for example, what we try to do is all the different ways people think about studying the use of research evidence all around the world in different kind of areas of academia and also different topic areas. We try to bring all these different communities together and say, well, what are we learning in the science of science, the use of research evidence in implementation science, in evidence-based practice, as Martin mentioned? How do we connect all those and make sure we really learn together and also learn from the slightly different ways we think about these topics in different fields? And so on our website, our Transforming Evidence website, we have loads of resources in this area if anyone's interested in that kind of super meta perspective. I wanted to just tell the story about this particular topic of the system support for quality use of evidence and how that came about and how we engaged around that. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, one of our areas is around this idea of sharing experience. And so when Mark was first thinking about doing this project, he came to see me in London. And can I have the next slide, please? We sat outside in this, and you don't sit outside very often in London, as many of you have visited, but we were sitting outside on a cool, fresh morning, talking about, and Mark was saying he was interested in this area and what research had been done already. And I said, oh, there must be lots. And immediately this piece of work came to mind on the underuse, overuse, and misuse of research. And so we talked a bit about that. And then I went away afterwards and actually found there was very little concentration on this idea of the quality use of research. We spend so much time thinking about trying to push research into practice that we hadn't spent enough time thinking about what does it mean to do that really well so that it leads to those improvement in services, improvement in the classroom, and ultimately better outcomes for our students. And so it was obvious that Mark had identified a real gap there. And now in lots of different areas, people are catching up and seeing this as important. But I thought it was really interesting how this was an area that needed more attention. It's always interesting to see the things we've missed as well as the things we've focused on. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to flag one of the things I thought was really interesting at the start of the Q project was that the project itself took this idea of, well, we don't just want to look at what happens in education, we want to see what we might learn from social care, from the policy, and also from the health field. And I think that for me, when this review work was being undertaken, it was very striking how much of the literature in these different fields focused very much in on those independent practitioners, whether it be social workers, healthcare workers, or educators, and thought about how to fix them and make them better, and didn't really get to this issue about thinking about the sort of context and the sort of systems challenges that we're thinking about today. So they're really a bit of a kind of a focus in on there on just thinking about how we fix individuals. And that's often the case in policy, where we think, oh, let's just get this one person fixed and everything will transfer and transform. So that came through from the review, and it's really interesting now to see that it's also been a subject that's been explored so deeply in the interviews for the Q project. Next slide, please. So I wanted to finish up by reflecting on how that echoes with the community as a whole, and really link back to some of the things that have been said already. The first, I guess, is Skye's point that it's really, really important that we keep hold of this idea of researchers doing really good quality dissemination and accessible outputs. As you know, these are busy people working in schools. Things need to be presented in a way that they actually can access. They're not hidden away in databases that are inaccessible. So we still need to keep hold of those very basic ideas in evidence use, which are about making sure the research we present and share in a way that is accessible to all the different communities, including, as has been mentioned already today, students who are often missing from our debates about evidence use in education. We also need to keep working on those relationships, so connecting people, so those participations in networks and how we talk and think through these issues help us take forward our thinking. So that's super important. But what we're layering on top of that now, and this is where the field as a whole is, as well as this project and the thinking you're doing today, is, well, what are the systems elements we need to think of, and why this feels so important to me is a project I did a few years ago when we were looking within the healthcare system, which is much more developed in terms of resources, infrastructure. And we looked at a set of individuals who'd had lots of capacity building. So they'd been on courses, they'd had fellowships and exchanges, and they went back into their institutions and they encountered 3 different levels of resistance to their new skills. One was from their teams who were like, well, get back to work. You've had your fun and your time out. One was from their managers who said, I've been covering for you, there's work to be done, and you've had your opportunity to be developed, get on with your job. And the other was from the kind of organization as a whole that had no way of using their new skills and capacity. So this is back to this issue, we focus too much on the individuals and we don't think, well, how does the system need to breathe and allow those people to contribute? How do we bake it in? I think that's a beautiful analogy. And we do know much more now, as we've been starting to pick up. There were some lovely comments in the last Slido about what that looks like, actually what we need to do. And when I first started thinking about this issue about 10 years ago, and there was a paper written, a very influential paper, and I phoned the authors and said, you don't say enough about what systems, and they said, well, we don't know the answers. Whereas now I think we have a much richer idea of what we need to do. We need to think about the resourcing, which is financial, but also in time. We need to think about those leadership components that people have mentioned. And we need to think about things we can do to change and improve systems. And the most exciting idea that's coming out of the US at the moment is building kind of authentic partnerships between research and practice, so that researchers, practitioners, and students can think together about what their shared agendas are for research, can do some co-production of research, and can work together to help that research be used better in practice. So there are finally kind of ideas and things that we can share that are really going to push us forward to building things that are genuinely useful for schools and are really going to improve things for students. So I think this is a really exciting time to be thinking and talking about systems. I'm over to you, Jo.
Oh, Annette, I love that. There's so many things I want to pick out. I'm not going to bog down the chat with that example that you gave, but let's just throw to the audience while you and I have a chat. I'd love to hear from others about maybe what they took out of your presentation that we can learn from other sectors or other contexts about embedding research use within Australian education systems. But I guess first for me, I want to just, if Skye and Martin want to join us, please join at this point. This notion of authentic partnerships with, I remember when I joined the Q Project and I said to Mark, please join as well. I said to Mark, oh, relationships, what a ridiculous, that just seems so stupid, right? How does that factor into quality research use? Well, after 4 years, I can honestly say relationships is my favorite aspect of quality research use. I think it's just so untapped in terms of the power of connecting different people and leveraging different relationships. So I'm interested from you, Annette, when you say authentic partnerships, what do you mean by that?
So I think it's very easy for us to say that we're working in partnership with each other, whereas really we mean one organization or one individual is driving a process, setting the agenda, gets all the money. So authentic partnerships is about genuinely kind of shared agendas that are negotiated and discussed, long-term partnerships, building trust so that we can work together and we can understand where each other are coming from. And a number of the partnership projects that have been run around the world have started with this idea that the practitioners or policymakers who are part of the partnerships need training and capacity building. And of course, as big a part of that partnership is academics learning to be good partners to their service providing and policy partners. And that's a learning journey too.
Yep. Martin, I want to throw to you, when Skye and I have been talking over recent weeks about the relationships that she's created and the connections that she's created for herself and for her school to move forward, what role, if any, do you think jurisdictions or departments of education need to play in terms of helping people like Skye develop authentic relationships, or is that really up to Skye?
I think you've got to think about it in those two, in the time flexible, right? So it's you can't impose those on schools. You can't tell them what the relationships are going to be. You can't do this kind of simple, this is a structure that will work and put that on top. I think what the system can do is to be an enabler, is to position schools well to make those contacts, to make those connections, and to build an ecosystem, to build a network of networks. And I think that's about connecting with other educators, connecting with peers, as well as connecting with researchers, and connecting with educators who have engaged with research. So we're building up this ecosystem. I think that's some of the most sophisticated enabling that systems can do, as well as the things around, time and access to research and some of those things, creating that ecosystem.
Yeah. Fantastic. Mark, there's a bit of comment around breaking down barriers. A number of our members of the audience who are engaging through the chat are talking about breaking down barriers. From your perspective, from our research perspective in Q, what do you think these major barriers are, particularly to relationships, as Annette and Martin have talked about?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess it's a little bit, I mean, I'd probably go back to the idea of embedding being about kind of integration and support, in the sense that some barriers are about that are kind of getting in the way of quality research use being spread, whereas others are the sort of culture of the system isn't, quality research use is going against the grain of the system. So I think it's thinking about barriers both in terms of how can we enable quality research use to develop. Yeah, so I mean,
Skye, do you want to comment? Sorry, Mark, are there barriers that you see to forming relationships, the ways in which, Annette has talked about authentic relationships?
I think sometimes it's really about you only know what you know. So sometimes you don't know that schools are in very similar situations to you, or leaders are in similar situations to you. So you have to have that network there to be able to build those relationships. And the more that you network, the more relationships you build. The more relationships you build, the stronger your systems and those networks become. So I think sometimes the barrier is you don't know that you're missing out on networks or relationships because we're not in each other's schools all the time, or you don't know sometimes what schools outside your maybe your school network might be doing that is similar to you. So we're often reinventing the wheel sometimes because we don't have those networks and those relationships, but sometimes we don't know that we're missing them at the same time.
Oh, I want you to hold that thought because I've got other questions for you. But we're gonna throw now to Q&A time. So I thank all of the presenters, and we're just going to open this up. And the way that this works is we're going to put some questions. People are going to pose some questions, and then they're going to vote on which ones they really want you to answer. So as we're doing that, I'm going to open that back up again. So I'll start here, Skye, and it's sort of related to the first question. So you've just said, like, it's about what you know and what you don't know, right? So how do you know? Yeah. How, if you were giving advice to school leaders that are online at the moment or may watch this in the future, how do you get in the know? And how much should you be relying on other people like the Martins of this world, or like universities like Mark and Annette? How much is your responsibility for increasing or improving your network, and how much is it the responsibility of other people?
I think it'd be great to have both of those things happening simultaneously. So I'm very lucky because I am so heavily involved in the Primary Principals Association and what they provide. And it even comes down to the What's Hot newsletter that our president writes about sharing the good oil. And when the oil is shared, you think, oh, I'd really like to hear more about that. And you create that connection. So yeah. The Department of Education in New South Wales knows that we've got incredible schools doing incredible things. So finding, I guess, a platform to maybe be able to share that going back to a few things that we've mentioned before, in a way that is easy to access, trolling through lots of different pieces of information to pick out the thing that might fit your need can be really time consuming. So being able to do that through a different platform would be wonderful. So I really think it's a balance between both. But for my advice as a leader, and I think one of my favorite things to do is network. I love going to whatever I can and making the most of every interaction that I have. So any person in the room, I would like to know, I want to know what their story is. I want to know what they're doing in their school. And it's not about picking up what they're doing in their school and plopping it into my school. It's about having that conversation, the why behind it, that thoughtful engagement in why did you do this? So I think it's a balance of both those things, that it is up to the individual leader and educator to make those connections, but system connections, and whether it is things like the Department of Education or utilising the Primary Principals Association or those professional organisations, leveraging off those people as well.
That's great advice. Martin, you're next in the hot seat. In the context of system enabling responsiveness, how can we close the feedback loop with our schools' feedback to the system?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. It's a really great question, and of course a tricky one in a complex system. I think a couple of quick things. I think one is that we've got to listen to some of the weak signals that we hear from our system, and some of those. So actually getting in there and making sure that the voice of principals through their associations and other networks that they have can feed back into the system. So there's an authentic listening that's required. Yeah. I think that's also true for the way that systems authentically listen to students and their feedback for systems as well. Now that's not telling you, it's not the direct feedback loop, but it's telling you something about what's happening in your system. I think there's something there as well about systems being proactive. So if you think about what I might consider to be a good school within our system, for me, the best schools are the schools that make the biggest difference to kids. They're not necessarily the schools that are getting the highest grades. It's the schools that are making the biggest difference to kids. So identify those schools and go and listening to those schools in particular. And then I would say the last piece is probably inviting researchers into our schools to actually either evaluate or indeed do some of the research around what is making a difference in our system, in our particular context.
Fantastic. Annette, you're up next. From your knowledge of other sectors, what is one piece of advice you would give to Martin or other jurisdiction leaders to focus on to support schools' improved use of research?
Okay, so the trickiest thing is only having one. I've got a list here. But if there really is one, it probably is about resources, financial resources, because schools are so strapped around this particular area. But also I think there's an issue around recognizing some of the things that are hard to measure, like network participation that schools do, and recognizing that because it's so hard to prove. Space for schools to do this, so there's that flex, and that Martin mentioned, I think is super important, space to think and work through schools' own priorities, and incentives and leadership. So that's not one. I've got even longer list.
That's a few, and they're not easy either, are they?
No, definitely not.
Wave that magic wand. All right, let's put Mark and Skye in the hot seat. So I'd love both of your perspectives here. One of you is a practitioner, one of you is a researcher. How can we reduce the gap of communication among practitioners and researchers in a complex system? Skye, you're up first. Mark, you can respond.
I think I actually touched a little bit on this in the slides that I talked about, and it's that pracademic. I'm really interested in that space. People who are researchers in complex systems, but are still acting leaders in schools. So they have their feet in both camps. I'd really like to dig deeper into the impact they can have on our system and using quality evidence and research in our schools. So I think for me, I think that will be a bit of a game changer, getting some knowing and being able to leverage the understanding of pracademics who have their feet in both camps. I would really like to see a little bit more of access to those kinds of people.
Mark, is there such a thing as a pracademic?
Yeah. Skye's there are plenty of them around, and as Skye said, they're worth their weight in gold. And Deborah In from WA is a good example. Look, what would I say? I mean, I think I'd pick up on the listening point, which has been made by both Annette and Martin, in the sense that closing the gap is a gap of understanding, and it so often research and researchers are seen as people who have knowledge and will be talking, and I think it has to be the opposite. It's about humility and listening, and what are the questions to which what are the issues to which you don't have answers right now? What are the challenges on your plate? Are the kind of open questions that researchers need to be listening to practitioners about. And I think the other thing is that the gap is not about knowledge transfer. It's a professional learning, a shared professional learning gap. So it's about bringing researchers and practitioners together around improvement, at the school and system level.
Martin, I can see you nodding at that. What are you nodding about?
It's this idea of that Mark's talking about kind of removing the fence. Kind of not sort of about throwing information over the fence to each other, and that would include systems in that as well. It is about us working together. It is about us being that kind of ecosystem. There's the iterative nature of listening carefully to each other, responding to that, asking good questions of each other, because we've all got a role to play in a system. So researchers, the system leaders, practitioners, students, and really when you get that interplay between all of those components, we've all got a role to play, and we should be confident in the role that we each play in the system, rather than, as Mark said, kind of the old hierarchical style of somebody's above somebody else and you just have to tell them that information. We've got to see ourselves as having, every single one of us as having a strong role in the research education ecosystem.
Yeah, I love that. Look, we could keep going. I want to thank everybody online. There's been such great, lively interaction with this discussion. We could go on for hours, but we can't. So is there a final point from each of you that you would like to make before we close out the session? I might start with you, Annette. You're at the top of my screen.
I think just to reiterate something I said earlier, that this is all really important, but we shouldn't throw out also the idea that we need to stay really good at communicating our research findings, and that's still something that we could get better at.
Yeah. I'm hearing a lot about communication tonight, and about being open and practical and considerate too of different parties and different needs. So I love that comment. Mark, you're next on my screen.
Thanks, Joe. I really love the tight and flexible. That's a real something for me. You know, I think being really, really smart about where we hold tight and where we promote flexibility. I think that's absolutely central to embedding quality use within systems.
I agree. That's really piqued my interest as well. And I've already direct messaged Martin and said I'm going to track him down on tight and flexible. Skye, what about you? You're next on my screen.
Building on that, that's probably going to be the tight and flexible is going to be one of my new coin terms, I think, if I can borrow that, Martin. But for me, it's really about understanding about the thoughtful engagement and the quality use, but building on those elements is developing the relationships to create systems that work for you and your people to really drive the outcomes and improve the outcomes for student learning. Because as we've spoken about tonight, at the core of all of this is our kids in our schools, and making the difference for them and for the generations to come.
Yeah, well, you're singing to my song, Skye. It's all about relationships for me. Martin, the very last word.
Thanks, Joe. For me, I think one of the challenges for us is that if we're going to use research well in our systems and in our classrooms, we have to have a learning culture in a school and a learning culture in a system as well. And yet many of the drivers, many of the pressures that are on us, both as systems and in schools, drive us towards a performance culture. I think there's something there that we really need to work hard at, shifting to a learning culture and maintaining that. We all want to perform, but really performance will come by focusing on learning and development when you're in a complex system. I think that's something that we could work hard on together.
I love that. I think that is such a great final word, and just it sums up a lot of what we've found over the last 4 years in the Q Project, that the schools that are feeling most empowered about their own journey, about their own performance, and about their own student outcomes really emphasize a mindset of inquiry and learning. And they never underestimate it. They never take it for granted. And they say it's something that needs to be worked on daily, weekly, yearly, but they're passionate about it. So I think that that's a great last word. Thank you. Thank you all. Let's go to the closing slides, Chantel. I'd just like to thank each of you rock stars, and you are rock stars: Annette Boaz, Mark Rickinson, Skye Ramsey, and Martin Westwell. Please, any of you online, if you're interested in any further information about these rock star individuals or about the Q Project, please make contact with us. Be aware that we've got some great publications coming out. Believe it or not, we have a publication coming out, our first findings around systems. That is coming out, but we have a wonderful, we've had a lot of impact over the last 4 years with our Q suites, with practitioners in particular, and we've got another one coming out, and this one in particular is around infrastructure. How do you build infrastructure for quality research use? Just a quick nod to other exciting things that are happening at Monash Education. If you're interested, Social Inclusion Week is coming up, and there's a lively panel presentation about innovative approaches to supporting the achievement, engagement, and well-being of young people. So if you're interested in that at all, please follow us at Monash Education or go online and have a look at these these events. But thanks again to the wonderful Annette, Mark, Skye and Martin. And thanks again to all of you for engaging in what we think is a really important conversation to improve the use of research in education. And at the end of the day, we're all here to try and improve educational practice for the outcomes of students. So until next time, be good, be inspired to use research.